Blight by Orpheus Kidwell, Chapter 1. Remnant is home to four kingdoms: Vale to the south, Atlas to the north, Vacchio to the west, and Mistral to the east. These small beacons of hope in the darkness are insignificant in comparison to the overreaching darkness that claims most of the world's 5 continents. This vast stretch of land and sea outside the protection of the kingdoms goes by a simple name that strikes fear into civilians and hunters alike: the Blight. Life is twisted, light is dark, shadows live, and the living die where the Blight touches. Worst of all, the creatures of grim roam unchecked in this terrible place that may as well be a whole other world as far as the kingdoms are concerned. On the easternmost continent, where the kingdoms of Vale and Vacchio called home, thousands upon thousands of miles away from either of them, on the southernmost point lay a building of cold steel. This complex lay within thick walls that seemed to touch the sky. There was not a dent to be seen in the framework, though there were plenty of scorch marks. The sole entrance by a mechanical section of the wall set to lift up enough to allow passage when active. The complex itself had a multitude of buildings within, all made of the same uniform metal, which lacked dents, damage, and decoration. Every door was thick, tall, and only opened electrically from the signals of a large tower that lay in the very center of the compound. It might have been tallest of the buildings there if not for the towers at each of the 4 corners of the already titanic walls. Each of these were cylindrical with a large dust cannon mounted on the very top. One building in particular, however, stood out amongst the otherwise unassuming layout. It did not dominate the skyline like the walls and towers. Rather, it took up the most land area of any building there. A caramel-skinned girl with mint green hair tied in a ponytail walked right up to it. She seemed to be on the verge of adulthood, with such a confident and commanding aura that there was no doubt she was either high in the chain of command or very important to the complex. Her red eyes looked forward, ignoring anything and everything else around her. She wore a short olive top that exposed her midriff and a pair of brown chaps over her dark green pants. She also wore a pair of plain dark brown shoes and white half gloves. "Ah, Miss Ostrin," one of the 2 guards in front of the building announced, as he finally noticed the girl. The second guard, who had never seen the team before, looked skeptical at her as his partner saluted the vedette. She crossed her arms beneath her developing bust as she noted the man she hadn't met before, not showing her respect. "Cobalt!" the first man hissed. "Do it!" The man looked between the two before sighing and mimicking his partner. The teen smiled as she walked past them through the open door. "Cobalt, you're suicidal. That's Emerald Sustain, number 7's handler." The second man widened his eyes upon hearing that and swallowed. "That little girl is strong enough to keep one of the whites under control," Cobalt whispered, getting a nod from his partner. First that blonde and puppet boy, and now this teenage girl. Why are these people so young?" Ignoring the 2 men as she walked through the hallway, Emerald smiled to herself. "With everything that the slave driver overseer has had me doing, I haven't been able to visit you in such a long time, Fu. I hope you and your other family have been doing well." Her smile changed to a curious frown as she heard a strange noise in the background. Frowning the noise, she eventually came to an indoor training area. The room had one side that was set up to mimic the battlelands of Vacchio, while the other was a miniature mountain that rose several dozen feet high. "All right, you two," a voice rang out in the exact center of the training ground, catching Emerald's attention as she noted three teens, two her age and one just 2 or so years younger, standing. The speaker was a boy with spiked blonde hair. His eyes were crimson with slit pupils and would have been menacing if not for the wide smile as his lips void of any anger or hatred. On either cheek there lay a trio of whisker marks as well. He wore an orange jacket over a black shirt and similarly colored cargo pants, a pair of leather boots, and a wide ankle-length trench coat with flame designs around the edges. Behind the boy, 9 foxtails, the same yellow as his ears and hair swished with white tips. Lastly, the blonde had a necklace with 9 grim mask shards on it, each one fashioned into a magatama. This was the boy Emerald knew as Naruto Uzumaki, though to most he was simply White Experiment Number 9. The boy to Naruto's left was the youngest of the group, only 12, while everybody else was 14. He was short, red hair, and a pair of light green eyes surrounded by black markings. He wore a brown coat over his body, though a light brown shirt and pants could be seen below it, as well as a pair of sandals on his feet. On his back was a large peanut-shaped gourd with blue markings and a cork at the top. Behind him swayed a large raccoon tail. It was a solid, sandy brown with strange blue markings that almost looked like runes instead of the normal rings, however. Around this boy's neck was a Magatama pendant made from a grim mask shard. This was Gara's Baku, also known as White Experiment Number 1. The last member of the trio was the only female among them. She had the same caramel skin as Emerald and the same shade of hair, though it was shoulder length and loose, with an orange barrette in the left side. Her eyes were a dull orange instead of red, which was a side effect of her experiments. She was wearing a white top that crisscrossed in the back and detached the sleeves with a sleeveless mesh undershirt beneath the top. She also wore a white skirt that was slit on both sides to reveal mesh shorts beneath it. The verdette had a set of 6 beetle-like wings on her back and a seventh protrusion of roughly the same size and shape of a wing in the very center of them. As with the others, she had a necklace of magatama made of grim masks, though her number's 7. This was Fu's strain White Experiment Number 7. "So, are you two ready?" Naruto asked as he looked between the two. Gaara nodded as he reached up and pulled the cork from his gourd. Fu mimicked the action, removing the lid from her tube after nodding. "Then let the battle begin." The blonde jumped back away from the two just in time to avoid a stream of sand from Gaara's gourd that slammed right into Fu. The winged girl inhaled and let loose a scream that shook the building, scattering the sand from the sheer force of her voice, before taking flight and hovering a few feet in the air. Gaara rose his fist up, the sand following suit and attempting to blindside Fu. It was unsuccessful, however, as she maneuvered around it quickly. From her tube, a black and white cloud emerged along with cacophonous buzzing. The cloud was revealed to be a large hive of wasps that flew at Gaara as quickly as they could. Spotting the new danger, Gaara sent his sand for the threat and crushed the swarm in a large cloud of sand. Loud squelching announcing hundreds of dead insects at once. While Gaara had been preoccupied, Fu shimmered momentarily before disappearing as her skin and clothing began to blend in with the surroundings. The raccoon-like boy realized this and stayed still, his eyes shut. Your camouflage can only do so much, Fu, he stated emotionlessly. They've been training really hard to master their powers, you know. Emerald nearly jumped as the voice came from beside her. Turning, she noted it was Naruto. The rules of the spar make it so that they can only use semblance and tailed powers as well as their bodies to fight. Fu relied too much on her weapons, so Gara had a distinct advantage here. Emerald noticed as she looked at the blonde, specifically at his swishing tails. These three and six others in the buildings were known as the Whites. 9 experiments created as weapons. Originally, each one was a normal human. Their unique, strong aura made them of interest to the group that owned this complex. Each of them had been modified on the genetic level and were now partly human, partly faunus, and partly grim. Their tails were an important indicator for power, as each white was infused with the energy of between 1 and 9 grim species. Naruto had 9, Food had 7, and Gara had 1. Each tail also gave the whites access to all the abilities of that grim species. With the sheer power the 9 whites held, they weren't perfect weapons. There was just one minor hiccup. The genetic experimentation had side effects, ones that made each white unstable mentally. My little sister does rely on Chome a bit too much, you're right, Emerald conceded, but that won't stop me from believing in her. Naruto grinned at the girl as she said that. What? Nothing. Fu's just really lucky, you know. Gara too. If I had a sibling, I'd want him to be my handler as well. Fu looked at the ground when he mentioned handlers. Each of the whites was assigned one or two individuals to keep them grounded and from escaping. Don't worry, after all, handlers will be a thing of the past. Emerald whispered, though she knew Naruto's sensitive ears would pick it up, and all of you will have a normal life. We're family, Naruto. Fu sees you as a brother, and that's good enough for me. Naruto smiled warmly at her words even as an explosion shook the entire building, stopping the spar. Gaara recalled his sand into a cloud around him, and Fu grinned widely. I'm going to draw in this round, you two. Naruto announced to his fellow whites. Gaara looked dissatisfied at the outcome, but Naruto ignored it. When they landed, the ground gave a small tremor until a crevice opened up between the quartet. Rising from the gash in the landscape was a duffel bag. Gaara opened it and pulled out a silver Khopesh, though its straight edge extended past the curve of the blade as a rifle barrel, while the hilt had a trigger. This was Shukaku. Fu took out her own weapon. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a 7-foot-long staff. Fu's canister buzzed with energy, however, as a swarm of Hercules beetles flew out and surrounded the tip. After a short time, they flew back into the canister. The Chome, the weapon, now had the head of a person. Uh, the spearhead itself added another foot to the weapon, while the protrusions on either side were sharpened and flared out until they curved into the tip on each outer edge. When Naruto grabbed a Kurama, it seemed to be nothing more than a simple dagger. This didn't last long. Something surrounded the weapon, but nothing surrounded it. Kurama's shape was distorted, but also seemed to stay the same. The air rippled, and light seemed to be swallowed within the area around the dagger as its form both distorted more and seemed more stable. Finally, the rippling ending with a snap as Kurama held a new form. Instead of one dagger, it was now in the form of 2 forest green revolvers. Naruto adjusted something, and the blades folded themselves from beneath the barrels, causing them to appear more like sickles than guns. Oh, that's quite the compliment, Naruto. Is there a particular reason you chose Scarab? Emerald wondered as an identical weapon was held in her own hands. I thought you might have gone for something like Son Goku in this situation, honestly. Naruto grinned as the doors to the arena they were in opened. I thought the versatility of Scarab might prove most useful in this fight. He responded as another explosion rocketed the complex. Looking at the doors, the quartet was presented with Naruto's own handler, as well as a group of security officers. Naruto's handler had gravity-defying spikes of gray hair and dark eyes. His face was mostly covered up aside from that, though, a mask extending from below his shirt up to the bridge of his nose. In addition to that, he wore a green vest, a dark blue long-sleeved shirt, and a pair of matching pants. In his hand, he held a tanto that was glowing white with aura and sparkling with lightning dust. We have intruders. You three, get to your stations. Gura seemingly had no response to the order, looking over the group of 12 or 20 with less warmth than ice as he crossed his arms. Fu was abuzz with energy in a metaphorical sense, while her canister was above with activity in a very literal sense. Emerald had a smile on her lips that you couldn't quite tell was anything but genuine. Naruto, he had a grin so wide it was a wonder it didn't split his face in two. Of course, Kakashi, the blonde responded as he began to walk over to the group. Nothing will please me more. As the four walked towards the group, several things happened at once. First, Emerald activated Scarab's Kusarigama form, giving several of the security officers grave injuries. There wasn't really any telling who was who with them, since they all wore the same uniform: black shirt, black cargo pants, and a grim-like mask over their faces, not unlike the White Fang. This was the complex's elite guards and Black Ops division. They had a fair few names depending on exactly who you talked to. Most people just refer to them as the Watch, though. Second, Kakashi, who likely was expecting this from the get-go, made to strike Fu, who had been in the rear. She didn't move, but it was necessary as Garo-san rose up in a wall that protected her from both the strike and the voltage. Where the blade touched, however, sand became glass. Third, the entire room shook as Naruto tapped into his semblance, 6 paths of divinity. Another crevice opened up in the room, and several members of the watch dropped in because they weren't ready to react to it. When the two groups separated, Kakashi was left with the 7 followers, while the Whites and Emerald were perfectly intact. I should have guessed a White wouldn't have any sense of loyalty, Kakashi commented coldly. Naruto shrugged. I mean, when you suffer dozens of experiments at the hands of insane snakes, things tend to get a little loose. Sanity, loyalty, commitment, I think they got lost somewhere in the sofa. Kakashi chuckled, falling into a stance with his tanto. I can see that sense of humor of yours is as terrible as ever. The blonde didn't say anything, he just grinned. Auras flared on both sides, but nobody moved. Kakashi jumped forward, but suddenly backpedaled as something else rose from the crevice. He may have been quick enough to evade, but others weren't so lucky. A large mass of ooze and slime revealed itself, consuming 2 of the remaining Ambu. There wasn't even a scream, it was so fast. The slime soon began to take a roughly human shape before its gray-bluish pigmentation altered to something more familiar. Utakata was a man with brown hair that reached his shoulders, a portion of his bangs covering his left eye, while an hojim stuck up in the back of his head. Portions of his chest were exposed thanks to how loosely he wore his light blue kimono, which was tied with an orange obi. Hanging from his obi were a pair of revolvers, though he didn't touch either one. Lastly, around his neck was a necklace of 6 magatama made of grand mask shards and 6 slug-like tails that erupted from beneath his kimono and seemed to be constantly perspiring. What was that about us not being loyal? Udaka wondered in a cheerful voice, though his expression didn't quite match it. Kakashi cursed as white number 6 showed up. Looking at the men he had and the threat he was facing, he grimaced beneath the mask. We're retreating. Don't think this means you'll win, though. We will make you pay for betraying us. Naruto just grinned at the man as his former handler left along with 5 Anbu of the original 20 or so. After they left, the blonde sighed before looking at Utakataka. You came, Utakata. I thought you were still on the fence about the escape. The man looked at the whites and Emerald before smiling lightly. How could I allow my little brothers and sister whites to go into the world alone? You will need some help, and Dust knows you can't expect B, Han, or Roshi to do it. I don't want Yujito and Yagura to be the only positive influences on you three, though I can't but hardly call those two a positive influence. Yujito is far too eccentric, and Yagura is Yagura. I'm glad you decided to join us, Emerald stated. Utakata regarded her a moment before smiling. Is there something wrong? No, I think that everything is just fine. It seems I can have some hope in humanity after all. Not everyone is so malicious as to wish death and imprisonment to strangers. So I think that that's something great. Everything is just fine. Emerald looked at him oddly before shrugging. Utakata always was an odd one. Now, what do you say we get out of here? With a grin, Naruto activated his semblance once more. This time, he touched one of the concrete walls. In an instant, it seemed to split in two. This was a part of his semblance that the complex had dubbed the hungry ghost who consumes. The scientists here were a bit over dramatic. Its purpose was to convert non organic matter into aura and add it to his reserves. Naruto didn't even know where the ghost part came from. As it opened up, the quintet were able to bear witness to a scene that would have terrified most. Instead, it only gave a grim sense of satisfaction to the whites. Bodies littered the ground, blood painted the pavement. Once proud buildings lay as mounds of rubble. The whites had struck their prison and turned on their captors. Naruto shifted Kurama back into its base state, tucking it into a scabbard on his waist. The wall that these people thought were impenetrable had large holes in it along the perimeter from what the group saw. With all of death and despair, the group knew that Grim would come quickly. They would be long gone by that time, though. This was the day they were waiting for.